My name is Fiona Davis, a 31-year-old structural engineer in Boise, Idaho. That winter night at my parents' table, the light looked expensive and the affection looked cheap. Richard Davis lifted his glass like a verdict. Diane Davis arranged her smile into something presentable. The decision was already carved. My brother, Ethan Davis, would receive $180,000 for a house. In their vocabulary, that number meant love with paperwork. I measured my breath the way I measure load paths, quietly, with evidence. Years of overtime, tuition I paid myself, foundations I checked in the dark before concrete set. None of it translated into stability, their sacred word. I asked for a modest loan to join a small sustainable build partnership, the kind that turns grit into equity. They called me what they had rehearsed, the failure. In their economy, my ambition was a liability. I drove home through a city that didn't care who deserved what. In the apartment's thin heat, I scrolled past the family thread, lot photos, emojis, certainty, and wrote the only sentence that felt like oxygen. I would stop trying to earn a place that kept invoicing my worth. Then I cleaned every trace from my phone and let the silence harden into a boundary. 3 years from that night, Ethan would slow beside my property and panic into his phone. That future had not arrived yet. What had arrived, by morning, was a corporate subject line that erased my job. It was almost elegant, the symmetry of losing both the family's approval and the firm's salary in the same breath. I stood inside the emptiness, and for the first time, it sounded usable. If this story of family bets and personal boundaries hits close, share your thoughts in the comments, then like and subscribe for more real, hard-earned resilience and family drama told with honesty. After that winter, motion continued while I practiced stillness. The email from the firm folded my old life. I filed it and shut the drawer. I listed expenses the way engineers list loads. Rent, insurance, groceries, debt. Pride became a luxury I stored away. The calendar turned into a grid of applications, each rejection a small bruise I called data. Boise in early spring throws a hard glare on pavement. I walked anyway, resume in a plain folder, boots on a metronome. Coffee shops, co-working spaces, small builders I left cards, promised deliverables, asked for nothing I couldn't document. Evenings were for refining my portfolio to fast projects that hold. I answered the quiet inbox with endurance. Savings dropped in measurable increments. I sold clothes built for conference rooms and kept the ones that could take dust. Some nights I lay awake under the heater's thin hum, repeating the only equation that worked. Keep going equals keep going. Work returned as a whisper. A tired cafe downtown needed to feel less tired, and the owner could afford almost nothing. I said yes before the number could frighten me. The space was a rectangle of good bones and bad choices, heavy curtains, dim bulbs, laminate that lied. I mapped traffic lines and daylight angles, then wrote a budget that treated every dollar like a witness. Tables from Craigslist forgot their past lives after enough sanding. In a borrowed garage, the grain remembered how to breathe. I repainted the walls the color of warm paper. I replaced bulbs with brighter, kinder ones and lifted the curtains so the street could lend us light. I built a counter from reclaimed pine so the room had something honest to lean on. I hung a simple sign where eyes land. During the work, the old rhythm returned. Measure, cut, check, install, step back, adjust. Said with hands, it becomes a prayer. Blisters argued. The rest of me negotiated. I kept receipts in a neat envelope and photographed each stage for a lean portfolio. Progress arrived in inches. The room woke up. On opening day, espresso smelled like certainty, and customers sat where the lines predicted. A local blogger posted photos with captions that change velocity. Small miracle, smart reuse, a space that listens. I filed the lesson. Keep it simple, tell the truth, let light do half the work. After that, inquiries ticked into my inbox like thaw from a roofline. A micro-bakery wanted shelving that carried both sugar and story. A yoga studio needed the absence of clutter to sell breath. A salon asked if mirrors could be kinder. None of it was glamorous. All of it paid what it promised. My apartment became a drafting nest, tape measures and swatches everywhere. Late one afternoon, while I checked the door swing against ADA clearance, a man stepped in. Boots polished by years, a canvas jacket fluent in weather. He studied the counter, the light, the seating, the way builders test whether a space speaks honestly. When our eyes met, he nodded once. He introduced himself as George Parks. He had land he no longer used and little patience for buyers who spoke in fantasies. He liked work that showed its math. He wanted to know whether I was someone who could turn a clearing into a life without pretending it was easy. I listened the way you listen when a compass needle finally points. I didn't answer quickly. I let the idea sit like a tool I hadn't reached for yet. Opportunity is responsibility wearing new boots. I told him I would look. He would bring a map. That night, Boise felt less like a test and more like a field willing to forgive footprints. The bank account still counted carefully, but my hands ached, and the work inside my chest sounded like someone knocking from the right side of the door. By late summer, the map led me past the edge of pavement, the asphalt surrendered to gravel, and the city's hum thinned into a slower kind of silence. I drove until the hills broke open into an expanse of pale grass and low pines, where the wind moved like breath through an empty cathedral. George Parks waited beside a pickup streaked with dust, the kind that only accumulates from years of steady work. He handed me a folded map, a handshake's worth of trust. The land was 4 acres half field, half memory, ending at a narrow creek that caught light like a blade. There was no house, only a line of fencing bent by weather, and the faint trace of an old fire pit. It wasn't pretty. It was potential. He spoke of taxes and soil, and the septic lines that might need replacing. I listened, marking distances in my head, counting the minutes between what I could afford and what I could imagine. I had saved $50,000. The price was $70. The missing 20 sat in my chest like a dare. Work had given me skills. Life had trained me for scarcity. Numbers on paper couldn't measure what it meant to build without permission. I told George I would consider it. He nodded once, as if he had heard those words before from people who later forgot their own courage. The next day, I walked the perimeter again. The air smelled of dry sage and new beginnings. My boots left faint impressions on the dirt that the wind quickly reclaimed. I studied the slope, the water flow, the way sunlight pooled between trees. Every instinct that had survived years of dismissal whispered that this land was waiting to be proven right. That evening, I called Caleb Moore, a former colleague who had once believed in function over form, structure over show. He had left the same firm months before I did. We hadn't spoken since the layoffs, but I remembered how he valued precision, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause. I asked for his opinion, not his rescue. He reviewed the numbers, inspected the map, and offered the kind of partnership that stays upright under weight. Half the investment, half the ownership, no illusions. It was practical, not sentimental, which made it feel safe. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was signed. The check drained my account down to anxious decimals, yet the act steadied me. Ownership has its own heartbeat. The first morning on the property, dew shimmered on weeds that had outgrown everything else. I marked where a foundation might stand and how far the porch could reach without stealing too much of the view. The blueprint unfolded itself as I walked. 1 floor, narrow windows angled to catch winter light, a roofline that leaned with the wind instead of fighting it. Caleb met me there a day later, measuring elevations, sketching drainage paths in quick pencil strokes. We didn't talk about design trends or aesthetics. We spoke in gestures, angles, soil depth, wind load, the language of people who build so that something endures. By dusk, we had agreed on the frame. It would be simple, sustainable, self-reliant, a house meant for quiet rather than display. When he left, the truck taillights dissolved into the distance, and the sound of the creek grew louder, as if reminding me why this mattered. I stayed until the stars began to arrange themselves over the field. The blueprint lay on the hood of my car, corners flapping gently in the wind. The name came without effort, Everhome Cabin. Not a brand, not a dream, a declaration. That night, I wrote in my notebook. Bought a patch of land, smaller than most mistakes, stronger than any apology. This time, no one can take it back. The sentence didn't promise safety. It promised substance. Boise slept miles away, unaware that something new had started breathing at its edge. When autumn arrived, the field began to sound like work. Morning fog curled low across the soil, wrapping the half-finished foundation in breath that looked alive. The truck tires left patterned trails through wet earth, and the hammering began its rhythm, the heart of what would become home. Caleb Moore marked measurements in chalk, and I traced them with my boot, counting each as a promise. The first frame rose slow and deliberate, beams steady under the weight of wind. Wood dust clung to my hair, the kind of dirt that means progress. Every plank was an answer to all the times someone said, "Don't risk it." The cabin grew in fragments: joists, panels, insulation, roof. Each stage demanded repetition, patience, correction. I learned again that creation is a form of endurance. When my arms shook, I reminded myself that fatigue was proof of movement. I measured twice, cut once, and trusted the arithmetic of effort. Lunch breaks meant sitting on stacked boards, eating with the same hands that held power tools. Caleb talked little, but the silence between us carried a rhythm precision meeting persistence. We didn't chase perfection, we built consistency. By mid-season, the walls were upright and the structure stopped being an outline. Inside the unfinished frame, sunlight fell in angled bars, catching dust motes that glittered like confetti for the unseen. The smell of pine replaced the sterile scent of my old office. My boots became my resume. My calluses became credentials. The nights grew colder. We burned scrap wood in a metal drum, the smoke climbing in thin ribbons. I wrote in my notebook beside the firelight, lines about patience, about owning every nail. I realized that healing was not a feeling. It was repetition done without resentment. Week after week, the cabin claimed its shape. The roof met the sky with a quiet confidence. The porch extended outward, not as luxury, but as invitation to breathe, to stand still. We reused everything possible. Old bricks, recycled glass, scrap from a deconstructed barn. Boise's thrift stores became treasure maps. When the electricity came on for the first time, the bulbs flickered like shy beginnings. I stood in the doorway and counted the hums, a sound warmer than applause. I didn't think of my parents, or the word failure, or anything that could subtract from this light. For the first time, the equation balanced. Finishing touches carried their own serenity. Shelves from reclaimed boards, fixtures polished until they reflected simplicity. I painted the interior a muted tone between sand and fog, a color that refused to compete with quiet. The final coat dried overnight while I slept in the truck outside, listening to rain drum across the roof like approval. When dawn came, the air smelled of wet wood and electricity. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the temperature of completion. It was neither joy nor pride, it was alignment. Everything built had a purpose, and none of it asked for permission to exist. I posted one photo online, the cabin bathed in soft morning light, framed by the trees, no caption beyond 3 words: built, still, standing. The response arrived faster than I was ready for. Messages poured in, strangers sharing stories about resilience, starting over, refusing to shrink. A local publication requested an interview. Headlines used phrases like eco-home miracle and self-made engineer from Boise. I archived them all, grateful but cautious. The work was its own headline. That evening, I returned to the porch and watched the sky trade its blue for ember. The forest rustled like applause from something older than approval. The quiet I had built was not silence. It was space that finally belonged to me. The project ended, but the pulse continued. Boise slept in the distance, its lights flickering like small promises I no longer needed. My hands ached, my body buzzed, and the air tasted of smoke and freedom. By winter, the house had learned to breathe on its own. The pine walls held warmth even when the sky refused light. I spent mornings tracing the thin smoke that rose from the chimney, a visible measure of progress. The cabin no longer looked new, it looked inevitable. Work grew from it like branches. People who had seen the photo online began writing, asking for spaces that could hold more honesty than luxury. I built a small studio beside the cabin, nothing more than a desk, a heater, and a wall lined with sketches. The inbox became its own terrain, messages from strangers who recognized themselves in unfinished wood and practical beauty. I designed small houses for people starting over, for retirees wanting less, for couples trading square footage for sunlight. I built quietly and invoiced fairly. Caleb Moore handled the structural reviews while I shaped the interiors, and together we proved that dignity could exist in simplicity. We called the work Ever Home Designs. The name wasn't branding, it was declaration. Articles followed. One headline read, "The Woman Who Built Her Own Beginning in Idaho." I didn't read past the first paragraph. Recognition had no place in the rhythm we had earned. The real reward was the sound of tools on wood, the scent of sawdust, signs that purpose still paid in effort. Snow came heavy that season, softening the world into grayscale. On certain nights I stepped outside to listen to it fall. Flakes whispering against the roof, the forest muted under its weight. Silence stopped being emptiness, it became confirmation. Every decision that once felt reckless now stood upright in timber and time. Months turned like pages, contracts stacked, bills paid, and the mortgage on the land shrank to single digits. The same hands that once held fear now held ownership. I sometimes thought of my parents in the abstract way one thinks of distant weather, no longer personal, only atmospheric. The distance had done its job. Then, without warning, the past found me again through an accident of geography. Late one afternoon, while I reviewed a design draft, a sound broke the steady quiet, tires crunching over gravel, a car too polished for this road. I looked through the window and saw a silver SUV idling by the gate. The logo gleamed with the kind of pride that demands to be seen. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, composed, his coat unsuited for dirt. Ethan Davis. The brother who inherited comfort. His expression shifted from certainty to disbelief, as if the landscape had rewritten the hierarchy he relied on. He stared at the cabin, the panels, the solar frames, the life he never imagined had room to exist without permission. From the porch, I watched him lift his phone. His lips moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I could guess them. "Mom, you need to come here now." The wind carried his urgency away before it reached me. He paced near the signpost, glancing at the carved letters "Ever Home Cabin." Recognition crossed his face like cold water. I stayed still, invisible behind the window pane, the same way I used to sit silent at family dinners while pride was served elsewhere. This time, I didn't need to move or speak. Presence itself was proof. He left after a few minutes, the SUV reversing down the path, headlights flashing like retreat. When the noise faded, the quiet returned, sharper than before. I went outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and looked at the place from a distance. The house, the studio, the workbench by the trees. It looked exactly like what it was, evidence. Inside, the wood crackled in the stove, steady and low. I wrote in my notebook, "You can't measure worth in inheritance. You measure it in what still stands after you've been ignored." The night settled, unhurried. I felt no triumph, only equilibrium. Success wasn't revenge, it was symmetry. The same family that once defined failure would soon have to face proof they never asked for. By early spring, the silence no longer stayed unchallenged. The same road that had once carried deliveries and lumber now carried the sound of unfamiliar engines. I watched through the window as a dark SUV came to a stop by the wooden sign at the gate. The gravel's crunch had the sharpness of memory. The doors opened one by one, releasing the shapes that used to define home. Richard Davis, still rigid in posture but smaller in certainty. Diane Davis, careful hair, a coat too clean for the forest air. And between them, Ethan Davis, expression torn between defense and shame. They stood at the edge of what they didn't understand, a structure born from refusal, a life measured in calluses. Their eyes swept over the cabin, the solar panels, the workshop, the markers of work that required no permission. I didn't move. Years of being talked over had taught me the discipline of stillness. My father's mouth moved, but I couldn't hear him through the window's pane. Maybe that was mercy. Words from him had always been designed to shrink space. He gestured toward the roofline, the equipment, the land, as if ownership could be undone by disbelief. In that moment, I realized how much of my past had been a long audition for people who had already cast the roles. I was never the daughter meant to be believed. I was the example meant to be corrected. Every insult, every comparison, every withheld glance had gathered here in wood and glass, waiting to confront its makers. I opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and met their gaze. No greetings, no explanations, just presence. The air carried pine resin and inevitability. My mother's face trembled at the edges, her eyes searching for a version of me that no longer applied. My father crossed his arms the way he used to when ending arguments. This time, there was no argument left to end. He pointed toward the cabin, the workshop, the panels. His mouth formed shapes that probably asked how. I didn't answer aloud. My response was everything he could see: the self-sustaining structure, the stacked plans on the drafting table, the clean lines of independence. Each nail, each wall, each measured corner had been built from the currency of their doubt. Inside my chest, the anger didn't flare, it solidified. What they had called rebellion was simply survival drawn to scale. They had built a house of comparison, and I had outgrown its blueprint. My mother turned away first, her shoulders folding under something heavier than disapproval. My father lingered longer, circling the edge of the property like an investor inspecting a bad decision. Ethan stayed behind, his hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes darting between pride and panic. He was beginning to understand that privilege had an expiration date. When they finally left, the SUV reversed down the drive, leaving behind a soft cloud of dust that rose and vanished in seconds. I stood in its fading trail, breathing evenly. The wind brushed the sign again, revealing its engraving under the dirt. Ever Home Cabin, proof, written in permanence. That night I couldn't sleep. The air inside felt electric, as if the confrontation had charged every molecule. I walked from room to room, touching surfaces, grounding myself in what was real. The house hummed with quiet resilience, walls holding both history and defiance. I realized forgiveness had never been the goal. Freedom was. By the week's end, news filtered through town: Ethan's new mortgage payments overdue, interest climbing, job offers thinning. My parents had withdrawn money to help, depleting what they once called security. Their circle of admiration had grown silent, the same silence they used to weaponize against me. I didn't feel vengeance, only balance. Actions had found their echo, and the sound was fair. At sunset, I sat on the porch with the last of the winter chill brushing my sleeves. The forest stretched endless, unconcerned. I whispered to no one. I owed them nothing, not even bitterness. The peace I had built required no witnesses. The sky shifted toward indigo, and the first stars appeared steady, indifferent, true. I closed the cabin door behind me, leaving the world to its consequences. By the next winter, the consequences had learned how to speak. They didn't arrive as apologies, they arrived as outcomes. Word spread through quiet corners of Boise: subtle things, overheard in cafes and hardware stores. Ethan Davis had listed his house for sale. The mortgage company had mailed its warnings in red. The couple he once called friends had stopped answering his calls after one too many favors disguised as invitations. His credit dropped, his confidence followed, and every decision he'd built on borrowed money began to tilt. I never felt satisfaction hearing it, only confirmation. The economy of unfairness had finally balanced its books. My parents, Richard and Diane Davis, had downsized to a smaller home outside the city. The retirement accounts once meant to fund stability now floated between late payments and regret. Neighbors whispered about their pride, how it used to arrive before reason. My mother filled her days with gardening that never bloomed. My father counted interest rates as if numbers could repent. The life they curated had started cracking from inside. Meanwhile, Everhome Designs expanded quietly. Caleb Moore managed logistics while I handled design. We built houses for teachers, veterans, single parents, people who understood what it meant to earn shelter instead of inherit it. Each project became a conversation in structure. How much strength could be built from less, how beauty could live inside restraint. Every so often, when the mail truck left letters at the gate, I half expected an envelope with my parents' handwriting. It never came. Silence, I realized, is its own kind of communication, the most honest they'd ever given me. The forest taught me new scales of time. Seasons turned without permission, yet always on schedule. Snow became a friend, not a warning. I learned to read the land's language, the subtle sway of branches, the creek's thawing edge, the wind's small revisions. My life no longer depended on approval, it depended on weather and will. Sometimes I wondered if they understood what they had created by trying to contain me. All the years of being dismissed had forced me to build a world they couldn't enter. My silence wasn't punishment, it was evolution. One morning, I stood on the porch watching sunlight thread through pine needles. The cabin reflected in the window beside me, a quiet mirror of consequence. Inside, the workspace glowed with early light, blueprints scattered like proof that consistency is louder than validation. I thought of the first night they called me a failure, and how that word had once been a wound. Now it felt like a foundation pane pressed into purpose. Every insult, every comparison, every withheld gesture had turned into a beam holding the roof above my head. By evening, the wind picked up again. I lit the stove, brewed coffee, and opened my notebook to a clean page. I wrote slowly, measuring every word as if it had weight. Freedom isn't granted, it's built. Love, if it's conditional, isn't love, it's management. And silence, when chosen, can be the loudest declaration of self. The line steadied me. I closed the notebook and looked outside. Snow fell softly, erasing footprints but not direction. The world was quiet again, but this quiet belonged to me. I didn't plan to see them again, not out of bitterness, but completion. Some chapters end because the story has finally outgrown its conflict. They had built their lesson. I had built my life. As the last light faded, the cabin's windows reflected the forest in gold. I watched until everything blurred into dusk and whispered, more to the air than to memory, I am enough. The wind didn't answer, and it didn't need to. If you've ever been told you'd never make it, remember, silence can be power, and peace can be proof. Tell me what you've built from your own storms in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories of strength, healing, and redemption. Thank you for listening.